It's a privilege this afternoon to introduce Ruth Valerio to you. Ruth has a degree in theology from Cambridge and a doctorate from King's College London, looking at simplicity as a Christian response to consumerism. As I've already said, she's authored a number of books which are recommended. She describes herself as an academic, community activist, eco-warrior, author, practitioner, veg grower, and pig keeper, all rolled into one. So you can see what we're expecting this afternoon. She's going to talk to us on why care for creation. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. Good afternoon. Oh, come on, we can do a bit. I know we've had lunch and we're already slumping. Can you give me a bit more encouragement? Good afternoon. Oh, wonderful. It's really lovely to be here with you. I would say thank you for inviting me, but you haven't. But thank you for those who have. And apologies to you because you have to sit through this next session and listen to me. But I hope that we're going to have a good time together. I'm going to do a good chunk of teaching, and then there'll be opportunity for discussions and for some questions. Why care for creation? To my mind, this just isn't a question that even needs to be asked. And I'm shocked and surprised to hear that we do still need to ask it today. In fact, I was talking with one of you over lunch who said they were talking to someone in leadership in their work context, a Christian work context, and they actually said that very question. When they said that they were coming, and this was one of the things on the in the course today, the person actually said, well, why should we care for creation? What's the issue? Why is this a Christian thing? And so I want to spend a little bit of time with you unpacking why I think this is a part of the Christian faith, actually a very integral part of the Christian faith. And what I want to do with you is not give you an environmental theology, because I think that an environmental theology is actually quite a dangerous thing that can do us a disservice as a church. Why do I say that? Because as Christians and people who like theology, we like to spend a lot of time developing theologies of things. We develop theologies of gender, theologies of disability, theologies of race, theologies of the environment, theologies of this, that, and everything. And what happens when we develop a theology of something is that it becomes seen by everybody else as an issue that you can put away on the shelf and as something that is only of interest to those few fringe people who are interested in that particular issue. So I'm not going to give you a theology of the environment this afternoon. What I want to do is very simply take you through the Bible and unpack the gospel for you. Give us a wide understanding of what the gospel of Jesus Christ is all about. Before I do that, let me introduce myself a little bit more, because I'm aware, other than a brief introduction, I'm a stranger standing up here in front of you. I work for Arosha UK, which is a Christian environmental charity, and Arosha is in 19 or 20 countries around the world, and every country that we're in, our primary work is some form of hands-on, scientifically based conservation work. So we work in the Lebanon in a wetland area, we work in India with elephants, we work in Kenya with marine conservation, we work in the UK. We have an urban centre that we run and an urban wildlife park, and we have a rural nature reserve. And we also partner with Christian landowners, retreat centres, and all types of different people, Christian landowners, and we work with them and help them conserve and look after the lands that is in their care. So we're a really practical, hands-on, scientifically based organisation. But because we are a Christian charity, alongside the practical work that we do, we have a very clear aim of helping Christians and churches understand where environmental care fits into the Christian faith. And that's my role. I'm Churches and Theology Director for Arosha UK. So I spend my time doing this sort of thing and developing programs, helping Christians and churches to integrate caring for the earth into their church life, into their church practice, really with the very simple aim of changing church culture so that it becomes as commonplace for a church to be engaged in acts of wider creation care as it currently is for it to be engaged with its community in social care. So I travel up and down the country a lot, and I would be hard-pressed, you would be hard-pressed to find a church that wasn't reaching out into its community in some way, wouldn't you? Or we just know all our churches do that, whether it's food banks or toddler groups or street pastors, whatever it is. We all know, I'm sure all of you are from churches that are doing that in one way or another. And if you were to go to a church or to be a part of a church or maybe even to lead a church that wasn't reaching out into its local community, you would feel that it was in some way deficient as a church and hadn't really fully understood what the gospel of Jesus Christ is all about. And I believe that that shift, because that has been a shift, I think that shift needs to happen in terms of caring for the whole world, so that it just becomes second nature, so that you would be hard-pressed to find a church in the UK that wasn't looking after the world in one form or another. And if you were a part of such a church or leading a church that wasn't engaged in environmental care, you would feel that it was in some sense deficient as a church and hadn't really fully understood what the gospel of Jesus Christ is all about. So I think that's the kind of culture shift that we need to see happen in the church. And that's what I spend my life living, eating, breathing, sleeping, dreaming, and being a part of working alongside many other people to help bring that culture shift about. And slowly but surely, I think we are seeing that happen, which is really, really encouraging. But why should we care for creation? As I said, I just very simply want to take you through the Bible, through the story that we have there. And where else would we start but in the beginning? In the beginning, as the opening words of the Bible tell us, God created the heavens and the earth. This isn't the start of a big debate around evolution and creationism and so on. And I know that you've been looking at and discussing and unpacking some of those really, really tricky issues already over the course of today. That is simply a statement that however we think the world came into being, God was the cause. And God was the underlying factor behind how the world came into being. And Genesis 1:31 tells us that the world that was created was, well, it says that God looked at all that he had made and said, it is good. Thank you. God looked at the individual days, so to speak, the individual components, and said it's good. And then he looked at all that he had made and said, it is very good. Now, I know a little bit of Greek, but I'm not a Hebrew scholar, so my very unacademic translation of that verse is that God looked at all that he had made and he said, it is fantastic. I love it. Look what I've made. This is amazing. If you're into any sort of craft, if you like making things, if you like cooking things, you know that feeling when you create something amazing and you want to tell other people, don't you? And you want to say, look what I've done. This is fantastic. And this is the sense that we get in the Genesis narratives, not of some dispassionate God sitting back and saying, yeah, it's okay, isn't it? You know, I didn't do too bad a job. God looks at all that he had made and he said, it is very good. It's fantastic. And I don't know today whether you've looked at, as you've been thinking around creation and evolution and so on, whether you've looked at all at some of the other creation narratives that were circulating around the same time as the Genesis narrative was coming into form. But the other really big creation story, Enuma Elish from the Babylonian period, describes the creation of the world as being made from a vanquished goddess. So basically you have this big picture of all these gods all fighting against each other, and then the big god defeats Tiamat, so the goddess, and out of her body she's cleaved into three, if that's the right word, cut into three, and out of the three parts of her body are made the earth and the waters and the skies. And so in the prevailing creation narrative that was around the time that our Genesis creation narratives were finding their final form, in the prevailing narrative, the earth, the world, came from something that was evil. And so it was an inherently evil thing. Whereas in direct contrast to that, our Genesis creation narratives say no, the earth is good. Why? Because it comes from a good God, and therefore it is very good. Inherently within itself, it is good. And so straight away we can see that this begins to give us an understanding as to why we should be caring for this world, because it comes from a good God and is something that is good. And in this little verse of Genesis 1:31, we see demolished 2,000 years of bad theology that have owed more to a Gnostic Greek dualism than have owed to anything that we've seen actually in the Bible coming from a Jewish understanding. And that dualism has separated out that which is physical, earthy, material, has substance, from that which is immaterial, non-physical, non-substantial. And we've called this realm spiritual, haven't we? And we've seen this realm as being in some sense superior to the earthy, tangible, physical realm, which we've denigrated. And we can see that in so many different ways through church history. You see it in the understanding of church ministry and calling, in the way all those years back in church history, those who were monks and nuns, they were the religious, weren't they? They were the holy ones, and then everybody else was just, not kind of quite as good as them. And that's come down a little bit into our church thinking, which thankfully I think has been eroded over recent years, where we have put it into a particular bracket, those who are in full-time Christian ministry, and then everybody else just does other things. And of course we now know that that isn't the case. We are all in full-time Christian ministry, just shown in different ways. Some of us lead churches, some of us are doctors, some of us stack shelves, some of us do whatever. All of us are in full-time Christian ministry. But that dualism has shown itself in that way. Interestingly, and I won't go too far down this route because it's taken me off my topic, we see it also actually, I think, in the split between male and female. So the male was traditionally seen as being more to do with the mind, the nous, and the female, because of periods and childbirth and so on, was more linked to the earth. And so I think that is partly something that has played into the problems that we have had between male and female and our understandings around male and female leadership. So you can see that this dualism has impacted us in all sorts of ways down through church history. But Genesis 1:31 just destroys that and says that matter matters to God. Getting your hands dirty matters to God because the earth is important to him. And so this world is created and it's soon teeming with life in the seas, on the earth, in the skies. And the final species that God creates, he creates and calls Adam. And this final species is an earth creature. Adam literally means earth creature, earthy one. The Hebrew for soil, for earth, is Adamah. There's a little word play going on here. We are the earth creatures from the soil. And this final species, Adam, is similar in pretty much every respect to the other species that are created. We're not actually, if you look at the biblical text, we're not the only ones who are blessed and told to go and multiply. All creatures are given that blessing. All creatures have the breath of God in them. The depiction of God breathing his breath into Adam's nostril isn't something that separates us out. It's more a fuller description of what happens elsewhere. All creatures are described as having the breath of God in them. Don't ever be fooled into thinking that Genesis 1:20 is about God breathing a soul into us or in some way distinguishing us. That's a really bad reading of that verse. So we are similar in all respects to all the other creatures that have been created, except in one regard. And what's that? How are we different? Yes, of course. And you may well have had some teaching around this already, I'm not sure. But we are the only ones who are described as being created in the image of God. And you may know that this reflects the Babylonian context, again, in which these texts are finding their final form. And the image of God isn't something that was an unknown phrase, which the author of Genesis kind of made up, plucked out of the air. The image of God was known in that culture, and there have been archaeological finds that have found some of the tombstones of the kings being described as being made in the image of Marduk or whichever god it is that they worshipped. And this is about representation and an ambassadorial role. To be made in the image of a particular god meant that that king represented that god to the nation, to the people, and ensured fertility of crops and social harmony. And actually what we have going on here is a radical democratization. In the Babylonian context, it was just the king who was made in the image of God, and everybody else were peasants and were servants and slaves. But the Genesis narrative says, no, all human beings are made in my image, are made in God's image. So there's a real levelling off here of, in comparison to the society that the Israelites were relating into. So we've been made in the image of this creator God to represent him and to carry out God's kingly rule. And there's an interesting way of translating Genesis 1:26 to 28, where we have those verses that God made humanity in his image, in his likeness. Unless you've got the most recent NIV translation, your version probably says, let us make humankind in our image, in our likeness. And then it probably has a comma or maybe a full stop. I was teaching on this in Sweden and they have a colon, I think. And then it goes on, and let them rule over the birds of the air and the fish of the sea, etc. And putting it in this way almost puts things into bullet points and separates out the idea of being made in the image of God from ruling over the rest of what God has made. So it almost reads, God says, let us make humankind. Okay, number one, we're going to make humankind in my image, whatever, and then we'll give theologians the challenge of working out what that means. Number two, we'll make them to rule over the birds of the air and the fish of the sea. The most recent NIV translation has come from the thinking of Chris Wright, who some of you may well know, a very well-respected Old Testament scholar. And he says that a more faithful reading of those verses reads, let us make humankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the birds of the air and the fish of the sea. So that, and Chris Wright says, it's almost as if God had it in God's mind that the final species he created, he would create with the express purpose of looking after everything else. We are that final species, created in order to represent God, so that there was a species that might look after everything else that God had made. And in case you get a bit hung up and have a problem with this idea of ruling over and rulership, just pause for a moment and scan through the Old Testament and have a think about what did God expect of his kings. So when it comes to rulership, how did God expect his kings to behave? What were some of the characteristics and the values that God expected from his kings? Can you just call out some of the key words that come to mind when you think of God's ideal of kingship in the Old Testament? Shepherds, yeah, thank you. Justice. Wisdom. Yep. Yeah, do justice, love mercy, walk humbly. That's right, care and compassion and love. So you can see in that list already, this is a very different understanding to the one that might automatically pop into our mind when we think about ruling. And actually the Hebrew for the ruling does have those shepherding roots in, shepherding connotations in there. So when we think about what it means to rule over the rest of what God has made, actually that is about being servant rulers. Our prime example, of course, is Jesus, and I'll try not to break into song about servant king. But we are here to be servants of the rest of what God has made. We are here to look after them in a servantly way. And so if we think about representing God and representing who God is, then we represent his fundamental nature. And the fundamental nature of God is Trinity, relationships. To be human is to be in relationship. The theologian John Zizioulas has described us as beings in communion, which I think is a really beautiful phrase. To be human is to be in relationship. And we represent God's fundamental nature by those different relationships. Theologically, those relationships have been twofold. They have been about our horizontal relationship with those and that which is around us, and our vertical relationship with God. I find it helpful to separate it out into our relationship with God, with other people, and with the wider creation, because we can often miss out the wider creation. So to be human is to be in relationship in these three ways. We were created to be in relationship with God. We know this, we see this in the Bible. Genesis 3:8, as God is walking in the cool of the evening. If you've been to a hot country, we might forget what that might be like at the moment, you will know that there's something very special about the cool of the day, isn't there? The cool of the evening, when the heat of the day has passed and the work has finished, and you gather with your family and your friends to relax and to chill and to have a bit of time together. That's what God is doing. It's the cool of the evening, and he's walking in the garden to meet his friends and to spend some time with them. We were created to be in relationship with God. We were created to be in relationship with other people. Interestingly, although we were made as these earth creatures, it soon became apparent that it wasn't good for this earth creature to be on its own. And until Eve is created, Adam isn't a proper name. Adam always has the definite article before it. It's always the Adam, the earth creature, the earthling. And then once Eve is created, then Adam becomes a proper name, and you have Adam and Eve, and you have man and woman together. So humans need each other. It wasn't enough, actually, for it to be on its own looking after the wider creation. They needed a companion, and so Eve was created and human community was born. And we were created to be in relationship with the wider creation. The earth creature, Adam, was placed in the garden, Genesis 2:15, to tend it and to take care of it, to till it. We were given the responsibility of naming all the other animals. But we know it only takes 3 chapters, not even that, 2 and a bit chapters, before the fall breaks these relationships. And Genesis 3 systematically goes through those 3 relationships. The fall, our decisions, broke our relationship with God. Adam and Eve, well, you know the story, you know what happened, I don't need to go through the detail, broke our relationship with other people. There's now fracture and discord between Adam and Eve. And the fall broke our relationship with the wider creation. There's now going to be enmity between us and snakes. Remember, when the creation narratives were written, there was no thinking that the snake represented Satan. It was simply another animal that came in and tempted Eve, and then Adam, and so on. And there's a fear that falls on people for the snake. And now I know, we have a snake at home. My daughter has a python. And and I know when I say it, I see this instinctive reaction in people at the thought of this snake, who's actually very beautiful and can't cause any harm. But but our wider community with the wider creation is broken. And the earth will now be difficult to till. I grow vegetables. I'm sure any of you who garden, when you go out and you do the digging and the weeding, you curse Eve and Adam and use it as a theological reflection on Genesis 3. The ground, the Adamah, literally is now cursed because of Adam. And again, in Genesis 3, you have that word play there. So then the story of the Old Testament is then the story of these broken relationships with God, with other people, with the wider creation. I'm not going to go through all of those verses, but it's just worth thinking about how the story of the Old Testament is, well, let me just put it in a different way. I think we're used to reading the Old Testament as the story of humanity's broken relationship with God and of how God works in order to restore that relationship through the call of Abraham, through Israel, through the sacrificial system, through the priests, and you have the whole story that we go through of the exile and so on. All of that is an outworking, isn't it, of God trying to restore and put back to rights the broken relationship that is there between the people, between humans and God. But weaving alongside that is also the story of people's broken relationships with each other. And so when you look in the Old Testament, I mean, what do you see? You see everything, don't you? You see greed, you see jealousy, you see rape, you see incest, you see fratricide, you see economic oppression, you see injustice. Every possible human ill that you could think of is there in the Old Testament. And the sacrificial system is there to help bring reparation for that as well. And then the Old Testament also is a testimony to the broken relationship with the wider creation. And woven into the relationship between God and humanity, there's always this wider piece about the land and about the whole of God's creation. And the land acts as a sort of spiritual barometer for the health of the people's relationship with God and with each other. Amos 8 is a good illustration of this. When the people turn away from God, and if you remember, Amos is speaking at the same time as Hosea, and you'll know the story of Hosea and taking the prostitute as an illustration of the people walking away from God and deserting God. So Amos is speaking into that same context. So the people have deserted God. And Amos says that you know that, actually not so much by whether or not they're observing their religious festivals and keeping the Sabbath and so on. Amos says you know that the people have left God because they're not practicing social justice. They're selling the needy for a pair of sandals. They're practicing dishonest trading standards and so on. So a lack of social justice is the indication of an unrighteousness, of a wrong relationship with God. And then when that is there, then the land responds. And there is what we today would call environmental upheaval. The Nile is in turmoil, and where you can read the words later, but very descriptive as to how the land responds when the people are sinning and not looking after each other. And there are other really descriptive passages in the Old Testament where the land is described as mourning, M-O-U-R, mourning, because of the people's sin, because they have not been faithful to God, because they have not looked after one another, because they're not practicing justice. Therefore, the land mourns. There's a really powerful connection that takes place in the Old Testament between God, the people, and the land. But then in contrast, Isaiah 55 talks into this. When the people turn from their wicked ways, when they go back to God, when they start looking after people again, then the trees and the mountains and the hills will rejoice. And I'll try not to break into song and whatever. No, I'll move on. And there's just this beautiful language about how the land responds according to the right or the wrong relationship with of the people with each other and with God. And the laws of the Israelite people are very clear that it matters how the land and its inhabitants are treated. So you will know that the Sabbath and the Jubilee laws aren't only for human beings, but they're also for the animals and for the land. There are laws such as a mother bird sitting on her nest isn't to be taken. You know, the laws are interested in how the people look after the animals that are around them and the land that they live on. Interestingly, I don't know whether you've ever picked this up when you've read the Old Testament, meat eating is only allowed after Noah. And I wonder, is this perhaps the ultimate indication? Is meat eating the ultimate indication that something is wrong between human beings and the wider creation? Discuss. The Old Testament finishes, where have I got to here? The Old Testament finishes on an ambiguous note. And if you've ever read any Tom Wright, you'll know this is something that he's very strong on. The people of Israel, yes, they're back in their land. Yes, the temple is rebuilt. And yet it doesn't quite seem a fulfillment of the amazing words that we have read in the Old Testament, that the people of Israel have known from the Old Testament prophets. They're not quite living in that fulfillment of those Old Testament prophetic words. And then emerging out of the wreckage of the Israelite exile, as they're taken into exile, as their hopes are dashed, you start to see coming through from the prophets amazing words of comfort and of hope, and words that speak into these three different areas of our relationships. Let me read out to you. The prophets begin to look forward to a time when, and this is Isaiah 32, the Spirit is poured from us on high. Sorry, the Spirit is poured upon us from on high. The desert becomes a fertile field, and the fertile field seems like a forest. Justice will dwell in the desert, and righteousness live in the fertile field. The fruit of righteousness will be peace. The effect of righteousness will be quietness and confidence forever. Here you have relationship with each other, relationship with the land, woven together in the hopes that the people are beginning to think about. And the Hebrew prophets begin to look forward to a time of peace, of shalom, when the harmonious relationships originally established back in Genesis are put back to rights again. And crucially, they begin to envisage a time when this will be brought about through one particular anointed person, a person who is specially chosen and anointed by God, the Messiah, of course. So keep in your minds these Old Testament hopes of shalom, of a time coming about, brought about by a person, when relationship with God, relationship with each other, relationship with the wider creation, with the whole creation, will all be put back to rights again. And then let's fast forward 400 years to one night when a large company of angels bursts into song in front of some very surprised shepherds, and they proclaim, "There is glory for God in highest heaven, and on earth there is peace among the people whom God has favoured." Actually, and I know we've just come out of Christmas, so maybe I can spoil it now and you can have a year to recover. Actually, the angels speak the words, but it's much nicer to say they sung it. But sadly, they don't. They speak it. But let's pretend they burst into song and they say these wonderful words. What are they doing here? These words aren't just, they're not the angels' way of kind of saying, "Hello, we're here." This is like a great big neon sign that the angels are putting in front of the shepherds and in front of us all, shouting out peace, shalom. The hopes that the Israelite people were looking forward to, based around shalom, about the restoration of relationships. The angels are saying that these hopes are being fulfilled that night in a particular newborn baby. And the good news that we celebrate is that through Jesus, through his life, his death, his resurrection, his ascension, the whole thing, all of these together have brought about reconciliation. And that reconciliation happens in those different areas that we have been talking about. We know, of course, that Jesus came to restore our relationship with God. That's kind of the stuff that most of us have been brought up with. But the New Testament tells us that Jesus came actually to do more than only restore our relationship with God, as amazing as that is. Jesus also came to restore our relationship with each other. That Ephesians 2, the dividing wall of hostility, has been broken down through Jesus between Jew and Greek. Galatians 3:28, because of Jesus, in Jesus, there is now no longer male and female, slave nor free, Jew nor Greek. I've put that the wrong way round, but through Jesus, our relationships with each other can be reconciled. And through Jesus, our relationship with the whole creation can be put back to rights as well. Colossians 1:19-20 is a couple of verses that I find very challenging. So I was always brought up to believe that Jesus' blood was shed on the cross for me, for you, for the people in our communities, for everybody in our world, that the blood of Jesus was shed for people. Now, before you worry, I still do believe that, so don't take me out and stone me. But Colossians 1:19-20 actually tells me something more, because it says that Jesus' blood was shed on this cross to reconcile to himself what? Can you remember? All things. I don't know how many years I read that verse and just implicitly heard people when I read all things. And it was a real shock to me when I first actually had my human-centered glasses taken off and I put on some slightly broader theological glasses, and I realized I'd been reading that verse wrongly all these years. Through Jesus' blood was shed on the cross to reconcile all things to him, whether things in heaven or on earth, which is, I'm sure you probably know, is a kind of Pauline way of just saying everything. It's the summation of all things. And I wonder whether Paul or whoever wrote Colossians, depending on your view of that, I wonder whether he had in his mind a bit of an echo from Genesis 1:31. So God looked at all that he had made and said, it's fantastic. And Jesus' blood was shed on the cross to reconcile all things to him. There's a bit of an echo going on here, isn't there? So I still believe that the reconciliation of humans to God is an absolutely central part of what the good news of Jesus is all about. But actually, I think if we stop there, then we're missing whole aspects of the gospel that we should be discovering. I sometimes think of it as being like an apple. And so the restoration of our human relationship to God is like the core. And I definitely don't want to be without the core. The core is really important. But if I only ever eat the core of an apple, I'm going to become quite emaciated and I'm going to miss out on the goodness, the whole goodness of the apple. And I think as Christians, we have missed out on so much because we have focused exclusively on the individual personal side of the gospel of Jesus Christ and have focused on it so much that then we've missed out on the wider implications and what the gospel is all about. So Jesus' blood was shed on the cross for the sake of the whole created order. And one of the wonderful things you discover is that where there is peace with God and peace with other people and peace with the whole creation, then we experience peace within ourselves as well. And what today we might call inner peace is something that the New Testament writers are very interested in and very clear about. This isn't a new phenomenon, all our talk about psychological issues and inner peace and so on. There's lots of that in the New Testament as well. So peace with God, peace with other people, peace with the wider creation, and peace with ourselves as well. And then when we look, as we start to look to the future, we've been going through this story that we see in the Bible. The Bible leaves us with some glimpses as to what the future is going to be about. It doesn't tell us much, and so we need to be very careful and very wary about speculating too much as to what the future will hold. But what we can see is that those relationships are central there as well. Revelation 21 and 22. God will be there in our midst. It's a very physical description, isn't it? It's a city with a garden in it. It's not some floaty heaven sitting up in the clouds playing harps, is there? That's nowhere depicted in the Bible. That sort of view that we're going to leave Earth and are going to spend the rest of our days in some floaty heaven, that owes more to Victorian hymnology than to anything that we see in the Bible. The Bible talks about us going into heaven, into God's space when we die and being held there. And then at some point, he'll return. He'll come back here. We will be like a victorious procession coming back to a city. We will be caught up. We'll go and meet Jesus, those who are still alive, and we'll welcome Jesus back to this earth. And at that point, the heavens and the earth will be transformed. They'll be renewed. There is no picture, no understanding in the Bible, unless you do some faulty exegesis. There's no depiction that this earth is going to be destroyed and we're going to spend the rest of our days in heaven. What there is a picture of transformation and renewal, of the reuniting of heaven and earth, of God being there, of people dwelling peacefully, of the whole creation being involved, the lion lying down with the lamb, and some of those beautiful pictures that we get in the Old Testament prophets. And they're all little glimpses, aren't they? We are foolish if we try and say exactly how it's going to be. But we do know that those relationships are going to be central. And so for me, it's this 3-dimensional, 4-dimensional maybe, understanding of relationships that defines who I am and what I do. And I think it's what gives us a full understanding of what the gospel of Jesus Christ is all about. So to put it simply, I want to live my life in such a way that my relationship with God and with other people and with the wider creation are developed. And if I'm doing things that harm any of those 3 aspects, then I'm not living out a fully gospel-centered life. And I want to help other people to do that as well. So I want to see other people's relationship with God restored. So that's evangelism, isn't it? I want to be involved with the spiritual disciplines. I want to be involved with looking after people who are less well off than me. I want to give my time and attention to my interior life, to how I treat other people, both those who live next door to me and those who live thousands of miles away, who pick my tea and make my computer components and grow my chocolate and so on. And I want to give consideration to how I live in this world, to how much energy I use, to whether I'm using more than my fair share, to whether I'm contributing to pollution and to climate change and all of those things. So I hope it's obvious that what I've been doing hasn't been giving you an environmental theology, but actually has simply been giving you a fuller understanding of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. Worship, evangelism, the spiritual disciplines, social justice, campaigning, ethical consumerism, spending time outside, planting flowers, helping people who are poorer than me, and so on and so on and so on. All of these are outworkings of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And they're all outworkings of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And they're outworkings of this relational understanding. And I don't see any of them as having priority over the other. So we can get caught up in endless debates over, is evangelism more important than social action, or social action, is that more important than environmental care, or is it more important to be spending time praying than to be spending time outside, or etc., etc. If we have those debates, then it means we haven't fully understood what the gospel of Jesus Christ is all about. Because if you have, then you wouldn't be talking about such ridiculous things, because they are all part of this one understanding of the gospel. So we don't pit evangelism against community engagement, or poverty relief against environmental care, or a life of prayer against a life of action. If we're sold out to the gospel of Jesus Christ, then all of these things we do and more, not out of duty, but out of a love for a creating, saving, redeeming God. And so I hope that looking at it in that way helps us to understand how environmental care is an integral part of what it means to be a Christian, and not just an optional extra for a few strange, weird, keen greenies who think these things are important. And I would like to give you a little bit of time to discuss some of these things. A couple of really simple questions. Very obvious. If creation care is an essential part of the gospel, how then should I live? And secondly, how can my church put this biblical understanding into practice? You've got, 10 minutes or so to have a look at these. So take a little bit of time to discuss, and then we'll have a bit of time at the end for some discussion and questions together. Okay, so over to you.
And before we do that, let's thank Ruth for
a little bit of time. I'm not going to go round you group by group, but it would be good to hear your comments, your thoughts over these couple of questions. Any particular thing that you would like to feed back, any conundrums you were wrestling with? So I'm just going to open it up to you for the next 10 minutes or so, then I'm going to conclude with a couple of things. So over to you. Who would like to kick off? Yeah.
One of the things raised was to do with, okay, so perhaps we should avoid buying things that have got a lot of air miles in them. Okay, that's fine. What does that do to the economy of those countries like Kenya and Morocco and so on if we do not buy the stuff that they are now geared up to selling us? So sometimes these issues are really far more sort of complex than they seem to be at first glance.
Absolutely. And sometimes even the issue of food miles itself is more complicated than we realise. So, for instance, fair trade roses grown in Kenya and flown over here use something like 7 times less carbon than regular roses grown in a hothouse in Holland. So if you only look at mileage, so you're right, there are very complicated issues here. And this takes us into big issues around our global economic system and our global food system, issues of globalization. I touch on quite a lot of that actually in Just Living, part of which is an exploration of globalization and consumerism, and then goes on to look at how actually can we respond. And we're in a very complicated situation where there are countries that depend on us to buy their products, but in the process of us buying their products, we are actually causing damage because of long-term climate change from the emissions. So we might be doing some good short-term benefit, but the longer term is more destructive. And my personal view is that we should be working towards developing systems, economic systems that are much more localized. I'm not completely localized. I'm not saying there shouldn't be any traveling or any trade or anything, so don't mishear me on that. But I think countries should be focused predominantly on growing products for their own people, rather than having to depend on selling into wealthier countries, because that then causes massive problems around issues of power and what happens when the market drops. And we've seen that, haven't we, in earlier years over coffee and rice and tea and bananas and so on. There are often big problems around chemical use and pesticides because they need to produce a lot of it in order to sell overseas. Lots of complicated issues around land rights. So I can't give you a comprehensive answer, but I would be in favour of moving towards more localised economies whilst not shutting off trade totally. But if we are going to buy abroad, which of course we are, I drink tea and eat chocolate every day, then I don't know if that's a guilty sin to admit to, then let's look for ways to do it ethically. So green beans from Kenya, there's a vast amount of difference between regular green beans bought from Tesco's and fair trade beans brought from that you can buy in Sainsbury's or the Fair Trade Foundation. The money from the fair trade beans will be going directly back to the farmer. If you buy green beans from Tesco's, actually the reality is the farmer probably doesn't see that much of the money anyway, so you're doing Tesco's a lot of good, but possibly not the farmer so much. So yes, lots of things to think about there. Very nuanced discussions that need to be had. Thank you. Other comments, questions? Yeah.
I don't know whether you'll be able to answer this or not, but through the last couple of days we've been reminded that the creation story and the scientific understanding of the creation of the universe are not incompatible. You then reminded us, of course, that the Earth will not be destroyed. But science tells us that the Earth will be destroyed, and that's now starting to mess with my head, and I don't know what the answer to that one is.
Yeah.
That might be a cosmology kind of question. I don't know. But
My very unscientific guess at that is that is the direction that the Earth is going into, but we're looking for a time when Jesus is going to return and intervene and transform things and make all things new. How that fits in actually with what's happening scientifically, it's exactly the same question as you've been grappling with Genesis. How actually does the Genesis narrative fit in with the science, with what we know of the science? And there are lots of problems there, and I'm sure you haven't answered them fully in your one morning or your last couple of days together. Or should we have the microphone?
We didn't actually talk about this in our group, but I sort of feel it's a bit like peeling an onion when you get to creation care. You start by thinking, oh, I'll grow some lettuces. Then maybe you start thinking about where you buy your clothes or your vegetables. Then you start to think, well, what are we investing in? And you get down to all these sort of nitty-gritty things about the whole economy and the institutions. So that's my contribution. Getting to things like, what are we investing in renewable energy? Are we investing in and getting to the sort of divestment debate?
Yeah, to me it's been like a snowball. So I started off with deciding, this is many years ago before curbside recycling, I noticed when I went to Tesco's, which is where I shopped then, that there were recycling bins that I could use. So I decided I would start recycling my paper. This is 20 years ago or something. And so I started to recycle my paper, and then I noticed there were tins next door and glass. So I started to do that, and then I started to do something else, and then that made me think, oh, what about this? And before I knew it, just to warn you, it was like a snowball. Once I thought about one thing, then I noticed and thought about something else that I could do. And for me, it's been about turning desires into habits, and it's gone through a process, I think, of desire, discipline, habit. So I might decide that I want to do something. What would be an example? So many years ago I would have driven everywhere, and then at some point I came to a realization that my driving habits were harmful, and so I decided my desire was that I wanted to stop and to cycle more and to be better in that way. To begin with, I didn't want to cycle more. I liked being able to get into my car, and I didn't want to have to drive when it was cold and windy and so on. But it became a discipline, and I had to discipline myself to do it. And then after a while, you all know the psychological thing, when you've done something for long enough, it becomes a habit. So then gradually, at some point, that discipline became a habit and just became a normal part of my life. So I now, actually, if I'm given the choice, would much prefer to cycle somewhere than drive. and I feel a bit naffed off if for some reason I need to drive somewhere. And it's been the same for so many different areas where there's been, what's the word, the thing, when a sense of conscience that I ought to make a change in my life. It's been a discipline to start with, but you do that discipline out of motivation, out of love for God, out of love for what He's made. And then you notice that that discipline becomes a habit. So I think that first question is about developing some of those godly practices and those godly earth care habits into our lives, which may well for some of us have to start off as disciplines, and then it will become just a natural part of how we live. Yeah.
I believe we should be very conscious with everything that we've got. For example, like money, if we invest in funds and don't know how they use that money, it turns out they invest in pornographic websites and all that, And same thing, for example, food, I'm afraid that when we're in front of God, He will say, okay, you ate that meat, right? Do you know how you got that meat, right?
Yeah.
So what do you think of that?
Yes, I think absolutely that God is interested in every area of our lives, and He is as interested in the sort of food that we eat and how we invest our money and how we travel as He is in some of the other areas that we may have thought of as being more traditionally Christian. If I can just, Ellis for Lifestyle aims to give you some help for quite a lot of those things. So it goes through the alphabet and takes an issue for each letter. So B is for bananas and looks at issue of global trade. F is for food, W is for water, H is for HIV, so it's got a mixture of more human-centred and more earth-centred issues. And it's what I would call a toilet book. I don't want to make a judgment as to how long your sessions might last, but each chapter is quite short, and you might be able to read it in one sitting. I couldn't possibly tell. And it gives an explanation of the issue so that we understand it, looks at it a bit from a biblical perspective, and then finishes with 2 or 3 very clear action points. So you can actually go away and do something about it. So that's there as a resource for you. And it covers all things like our money and food and fish. Also 26 areas. You can have a look and see what you think. So yes. All of these areas, I think, are important when it comes to living Christianly. Let me take you through, answer these questions. Where's my clicker? Just very briefly with a couple of slides. The second question, Claire has already mentioned Eco Church, and hopefully you've each got one of the Eco Church leaflets. We are just about to come up to our first anniversary. Eco Church was launched at St Paul's Cathedral at the end of January last year with Rowan Williams preaching, and it is there as a scheme to help you help your church. So it's to help your church integrate. It's not even really about becoming more environmentally friendly. It's integrating caring for God's world right across your church programme. So it's not just about solar panels. It's thinking about the worship and teaching of your church, how your church looks after its buildings and its land if it's got it, community and global engagement, and the personal lifestyle of your members. So it goes right across the full gamut of church life. And it's an award scheme. The award in one sense isn't that important, but the aim is there for it to be a tool and a motivation and an incentive for you. So please do take that back and have a look at it for your church. Go online. It's based around a very simple eco survey that you go through with your church in mind, and as you're going through you will see there are gauges that add up the points. It happens very instinctively, intuitively, and you'll see how it works. And it might be that you take 10-15 minutes with a cup of coffee and you go through it and find that your church has already reached bronze level, if your church has been doing some things, in which case that might be an encouragement for you. But there's bronze and silver and gold. And on the website there are a whole ream of supporting resources. So it's kind of a one-stop shop for everything that you need to help your church incorporate these issues into its church life. So please do go back and have a look at the website and sign up and get involved. I've brought a few more extra. If you would like to take any more of these back to your church leadership team to give them out and have a look at it as a church, then do come and help yourselves to those. And then that question, what can we actually do ourselves? I hope it might be helpful to finish by saying all of this mass of issues I would boil down into 4 key areas: the food we eat, the way we travel, the energy we use, and the things we throw away. So food, travel, energy, and waste. And you can think through, might there be one change that you could make in each of those areas in order to respond to what we've been looking at in this session? Right, I think I'm going to pause and leave it at that. I'm hanging around for 20 minutes or so, so please do come up and talk to me. I'll hang around over there by my books, and if you've got any other questions, anything else, then I'd love to talk to you. And and do give me back the Arosha UK sheets as well. That would be helpful. Lovely. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Ruth.